This is one of those moments where you can actually feel the shift happening in real time. Not quietly, not behind closed doors. Out in the open, with cameras rolling and statements flying, Canada just stepped into a role most people never expected it to take. And it did it without shouting, without bluster, and without backing down. Because while Donald Trump has been escalating threats, floating territorial pressure, and reviving a kind of chest-thumping imperial rhetoric that many thought belonged to another century, Canada has been doing something very different. It's been building alliances, publicly, calmly, and very deliberately positioning itself as a counterweight. And here's where things get interesting. This didn't happen gradually. It happened fast. Within hours. Let's start with the moment that set the tone. Donald Trump, once again, made remarks about Greenland. Not vague comments, not offhand jokes. Statements that many observers interpreted as territorial pressure toward Greenland, which is part of the Kingdom of Denmark. And whether you see those remarks as bluster, strategy, or provocation, they landed exactly the way you'd expect them to land in Europe, as a warning sign. Now here's the part most people didn't expect. Within hours of those remarks gaining traction, Canada's Prime Minister, Mark Carney, was standing side by side with Denmark's Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen. Not on a phone call, not through an intermediary, physically together, on camera, sending a message that didn't need translating. Carney released a statement that was carefully worded but unmistakably firm. He said Canada and Denmark are allies and partners in a shared responsibility for the security and resilience of the Arctic. He reaffirmed Canada's support for Denmark's sovereignty and territorial integrity, explicitly including Greenland, and then he widened the frame, linking that support to peace and security across Europe, including Ukraine. That last part matters more than people realize, because this
the future of Greenland and Denmark decided solely by the people of Denmark. In Greenland, we know that. It's why we cooperate, as I said at the start, and I'll finish here, why we cooperate culturally, why we cooperate economically, and why we cooperate in security.
I don't have a lot to add. I totally agree with you. We are very close allies and friends. I would like to thank you for your work within the Coalition of the Willing, your support to European security. We work very closely together in the Baltic states as well, and you have been very clear in your statement when it comes to the respect of national sovereignty and the respect of our common values, the only values where you can build a global world society on. So I really appreciate your strong support. I think we are both very into securing the Arctic region, and together with other NATO allies, we can secure the region. So hopefully everybody is willing to work together, and I think you are a very good friend, a very close ally to not only Denmark but Europe. So
thank you very much.
There we go.
Because this wasn't just about Greenland, it was about drawing a line between two very different visions of global leadership. On one side, you have a worldview built around pressure, leverage, and transactional dominance. On the other, a worldview grounded in alliances, sovereignty, and international norms. And Canada made it very clear which side it's on. Now, to understand why this moment hit so hard, you have to zoom out a bit. This didn't come out of nowhere. For months, Donald Trump has been escalating rhetoric toward allies and adversaries alike. Ukraine has been a major focal point. Trump has repeatedly criticized Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, questioned U.S. support for Ukraine, and floated meetings that critics say appear designed to extract concessions rather than offer genuine partnership. And here's where the contrast sharpens. Every time Trump ramps up pressure on Ukraine, Canada seems to move in the opposite direction. Before one of Trump's widely discussed meetings involving Ukraine, Mark Carney met directly with Zelensky, not quietly, not symbolically, with a full state welcome, the kind of reception that communicates legitimacy, respect, and solidarity. From the reactions I've seen, this wasn't lost on anyone, especially in Europe, and this wasn't a one-off.
Okay, let's talk about what Donald Trump has set out to do by invading Venezuela and kidnapping President Maduro and his wife. This has nothing to do with democracy. Trump has made it clear that the Democratic opposition he considers weak. He's not even going to consider letting them take control in their own country. It's about the oil, he said. This has nothing to do with drugs, obviously, even though drugs and drug threats were the original reason for him shooting people off boats and then seizing the oil tankers, because he just recently pardoned the ex-head of Honduras, Hernandez, who is charged and convicted of flooding the United States with cocaine. So what was the point? The point was to send a message. To send a message to Canada and to the rest of the world that what the United States is and has become is a gangster klepto state that will do what they want to do and shake down whoever they want to shake down. Gangster fascism. You know what he said at this press conference he gave was that American dominance in the Western Hemisphere will never be questioned again. This was sending a message. And it's a clear message to Canada. He said, we will secure our borders. We will stop the terrorists. We will defend our citizens against all threats, foreign and domestic. This operation should serve as a warning to anyone who would threaten American sovereignty. Well, clearly, Venezuela wasn't threatening American sovereignty. Venezuela was doing its own thing when Donald Trump, again, launched attacks on the fishing boats and set up the illegal blockade and seized the ships. Donald Trump is telling us that the oil that he is interested in getting control of is somehow part of the sovereignty of America. What he said was this was the Don Roe doctrine, you know, an update on the 19th century Manifest Destiny Monroe doctrine, but it has nothing to do with the 19th century Manifest Destiny. This is classic gangster shakedowns. Donald Trump is a gangster. We have to be really clear about that. It's something that the American media has tiptoed around and ignored time and time again. Donald Trump exists today because of the massive amount of dark Russian mob money that was laundered through his operations. It created this image of him as this wealthy tycoon. He has benefited from mafia money. He has benefited from criminal ties. That's who Donald Trump is. Donald Trump is a convicted sexual predator. We know this, and yet he was allowed to become president of the United States of America. So should we be surprised that MAGA, with its constant grift and constant threat and constant shakedown, is basically a criminal state run by a criminal? So that's the first part of what we talk about in criminal fascism. Ben Masilas from Midas Touch said that one of the reasons he started to work with me was that I was the first person publicly to identify the nature of modern MAGA as a gangster fascist state. I don't know if I was the first, but it was really important from the beginning of my work to try and make people understand what we were dealing with wasn't just a new manifestation of crazy Republican politics and right-wing chest beating, that it was something different. It was the gangster element, the kleptocracy, but also the rising level of authoritarianism, undermining the rule of law, threatening judges, going after independent media, the fascist element.
At multiple points when Trump's rhetoric toward Ukraine intensified, Carney either met with Zelensky shortly before or shortly after those moments. Each time, the message was consistent. Canada stands with Ukraine, not conditionally, not transactionally, but as an ally. Here's why that matters. In geopolitics, timing is communication. Meeting before a pressure campaign signals prevention. Meeting after signals reassurance. Canada did both. Now add another layer. Remember Trump's tour through Asia that drew criticism even from some of his own allies? Comments that were widely seen as undiplomatic. Moments that left leaders in the region visibly uncomfortable. From South Korea to Southeast Asia, the tone was confrontational and the substance often unclear. And again, Canada took a different route. While Trump was dominating headlines for all the wrong reasons, Carney was showing up as a steady presence, emphasizing partnership, shared values, and mutual respect. Not trying to dominate the room, just anchoring it. And that brings us back to Denmark. The visual alone told a story. On one side of the Atlantic, Trump allies were openly floating the idea of military force as an option regarding Greenland. White House statements, including one attributed to Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt, referenced reserving all rights, language that many analysts say is intentionally ambiguous, but unmistakably threatening. On the same day, Carney stood next to Mette Frederiksen and spoke about sovereignty, cooperation, and respect for the UN Charter. Listen to the contrast. Carney made it clear that the future of Greenland is decided solely by the people of Greenland and Denmark. No external pressure, no imposed outcomes, just self-determination. Frederiksen echoed that sentiment, thanking Canada for its role in European security, its work in the Baltic states, and its clear stance on national sovereignty and shared democratic values. She emphasized cooperation in securing the Arctic alongside NATO allies. No theatrics, no threats, just alignment. And this is where people online started connecting the dots. Because this wasn't just diplomacy, it looked like leadership. Which brings us to how this is being interpreted inside Canada. Former Member of Parliament Charlie Angus has been particularly vocal about what he sees as a deeper shift happening. In conversations circulating widely online, Angus describes the current moment not as a standard political disagreement, but as a confrontation with what he calls a form of gangster fascism. Now, to be clear, this is commentary. This is interpretation. But it's resonating because it taps into a growing unease. Angus argues that what distinguishes Trump's approach isn't just ideology, but method, pressure, intimidation, and shakedown tactics rather than negotiation or diplomacy. He points to actions toward Venezuela, rhetoric around resource control, and repeated framing of foreign countries as threats as part of a broader pattern. Here's the part most people misunderstand. This isn't about whether every claim is accurate or every action is legal. It's about perception and precedent. When a powerful country starts framing resource access or territorial pressure as matters of security, it creates a narrative that can justify almost anything. And Angus believes Canada is directly in that narrative. He points out that Trump repeatedly described Canada as a source of threats, from fentanyl to terrorism, despite data showing otherwise. Canadian leaders tried to counter those claims with facts, but, as Angus notes, the narrative didn't change. Because, in his view, it wasn't about facts. It was about establishing justification. And that's where tension really comes from. Once a narrative of threat is established, actions that would otherwise seem unthinkable suddenly appear defensive. Angus argues that Canada recognized this pattern early, and that's why the response has shifted from quiet diplomacy to visible resistance. And from the reactions I've seen, a lot of Canadians agree. Polls and social commentary suggest a sharp drop in favorable views of Trump across Canada. Not disagreement, not skepticism, anger, determination, a sense that something fundamental is being challenged. And instead of backing down, Canada appears to be leaning in, building alliances with Denmark, reinforcing ties with Europe, standing visibly with Ukraine, positioning itself as a stabilizing force in the Arctic, emphasizing international law over unilateral power. Some commentators have even gone further, suggesting that Canada is stepping into a role once associated with the United States, that of a reliable anchor for the rules-based international order. That's a big claim, but moments like this are why it's being said. Angus also points to something else that's easy to miss: hubris. In his view, the more openly Trump's circle signals dominance, the more resistance it generates. Not fear, resistance. He argues that European nations, which might once have bent over backward to avoid confrontation with Washington, are now realizing that neutrality isn't an option. You either accept the pressure or push back. And Canada, by stepping forward early, has given others cover to do the same. There's also a historical echo here. Angus references a quote from Winston Churchill during World War II, calling Canada the linchpin connecting the English-speaking world, bridging Europe and North America. At the time, it was about unity against authoritarian threat. Today, some see a parallel. Canada, with deep ties to the United States and strong loyalty to Europe, is again positioned as a connector, a stabilizer, a reminder that power doesn't have to mean domination. Now, is this easy? No. Even Angus acknowledges this is a dangerous moment, a volatile one. The risks are real, the stakes are high. But from his perspective, and from the way Canada's leadership is behaving, the alternative, silence, appeasement, ambiguity, is worse. And that's the core of this story. Canada didn't raise its voice. It raised its presence. It didn't threaten. It aligned. It didn't flinch when pressure came. It showed up, visibly, deliberately, and with partners at its side. Whether you agree with every interpretation or not, one thing is clear: the world is watching, and Canada is no longer standing quietly in the background. If you found this helpful, consider subscribing. I appreciate you.